Yeah, so welcome everybody. So the session is being recorded. So if you have any questions or any issues, please let us know in the bottom left chat box. And now I'll turn it over to Siri to start the webinar.
Thank you very much, Lily, and thank you to KPMG for sponsoring the 2019 Trailblazer Award webinar series. We're very grateful for your help and for my increased learning skills with technology. Good afternoon, everybody from Toronto, where it is an absolutely beautiful winter day, sun shining 10 degrees. My name is Siri Genik, and I am one of the directors of Women in Mining Canada, responsible for the Trailblazer Award series, which I am very excited to say will be kicked off the week of December 2nd. So for those of you who are online and listening, watch your social media where all the information will be indicated. Today we are very excited to welcome Heather Jamieson, Professor Heather Jamieson, who is the 2019 Women in Mining Canada Rick Hutson Mentorship Award recipient. This award was created by Women in Mining Canada about 3 years back when we unfortunately lost Rick Hutson, who was known by many of us in the industry as an incredible mentor. And we wanted to honor, as well as his family wanted to honor, his memory with this award. So ever since, we've had some incredible winners, and Heather is the third in this series, and I am delighted to welcome her. So welcome, Heather.
Thank you very much, Siri.
So let me just share some bullet points with the audience, and then I will pass the microphone over to you. So for those of you in the audience, Heather is, as we mentioned, a professor of geological science and geological engineering at Queen's University, jointly appointed to the School of Environmental Studies. So definitely somebody after my own heart, multifunctional, who understands the importance of environment and mining and bringing them together. Heather was born in the mining community of Noranda, Quebec, and she began working as a geological field assistant while she was in high school. So STEM way back when. She has been sharing her enthusiasm for environmental geochemistry with students. She's been introducing them to fieldwork at mine sites and exposing them to all the complex issues that are also affecting our communities in the Canadian North. So we look forward to hear more about that later. Heather has also supervised more than 50 graduate students, all of whom have actually found professional employment shortly after graduation with mining companies, environmental consultants, or as government regulators. So for those students who are online, she is the lady you want to speak to. And I believe we even have one of her students online all the way from Ireland. So we welcome all of you and we're delighted that you're here. A couple of few more notes. Heather believes very strongly that teaching and supervising includes respect for a good work-life balance. That is really, really important today. And she was most recently awarded the 2017 Peacock Medal for the Mineralogical Association of Canada, or from the Mineralogical Association of Canada, which is awarded to a scientist who has made outstanding contributions to the mineral sciences of Canada. So certainly a woman and a professional who is well recognized. So Heather, welcome once again. And thank you for being part of this conversation this afternoon. And tell us a little bit, to start off, a bit about your journey. So you talk about high school and how you started. What attracted you to geology in high school?
Well, thanks, Siri. That's a really interesting story. I think it's very unusual, certainly very unusual for a young woman in the 1970s when this was, to get hired as a geological field assistant as a high school student. That part of it is fortuitous. I grew up in Noranda, Quebec, so in northwestern Quebec. It's a big mining area. I had some interest in geology, but I was interested in all sciences, and I was a high school student. I really didn't know what I was going to do next. And the local exploration company, mineral exploration company, hired their first woman geologist, and they decided that she needed a female field assistant, and I was in fact a neighbor of the manager, so I think he chose me somewhat randomly, perhaps. But the next part of the story really is related to mentorship, and that's why it's important to bring it in here. I believe is so the young woman I worked for, Susan Atkinson, was inspirational. She was so excited about geology and loved being outdoors. We were really doing geological mapping in a very interesting area. And aside from Susan, there was a second woman, Andre de Rosen, who was doing her PhD at the University of Toronto, but was actually from France. And so she was doing fieldwork in the area. So she would join us occasionally and would sit on outcrops, and they would discuss all these geological ideas and ideas about their careers. And it was truly inspirational. By the end of that summer, I knew I wanted to head off to university and study geology. So I'm really grateful to those two women. They were real pioneers. I think, we may talk about some of the challenges and hurdles that one faces. Certainly in those years, I think probably they had even more than I did because they were, essentially a generation before me. So that's how it started, and an interest in science, and then a fortuitous encounter with a neighbor, really.
Well, I guess that's the importance of networking, and just you never know. From what I hear from you is who could attract you into the field. And I hear the words passionate, I hear inspirational, and I hear pioneers, and basically a love of the outdoors. Just listening to you, I'm a lawyer. I'm unfortunately not a geoscientist, but I almost feel like going back to school. So maybe not, but my father, most of you who know me, was in the oil business, and he was a petroleum geologist, and from very small shared with us his love of rocks. And he was my first mentor, and took me fishing in Flin Flon, which is not very exotic, but would talk about rocks and the importance of them, and also how beautiful they were. So the importance of the people that surround us, family, friends, neighbors. So you went to university, obviously. Talk to us through a little bit those years, and you mentioned challenges and hurdles. So going through school, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, so I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Toronto and my PhD at Queen's, and some of the challenges were ones that I think they probably still exist, but perhaps not as obvious it was back then. So back then there were relatively few women students. We were maybe 10% of the class. There was some resistance in, I think this was one of the major issues that concerned us at the time as female students, was a resistance to employing women in the field, either in mineral exploration or in mining, in the mines themselves. It was it was a very rare thing to have done it in Canada, and there was a sort of a mindset, I think, that this was something that was not easy to accept on the part of some of the traditional employers. So I had a great advantage in a sense because I had that job as a high school student, but I still was, turned down for a number of things. And I think those kind of attitudes, fortunately, have changed. Some of the other things about those years, in general, I found the education I received was was very good. I had a couple of, there's a story that I'd like to tell that
Yes, please.
stretches, it's a trajectory that stretches from my undergraduate years to something that happened here in my present life a few years ago. So at one point, I remember being told by a professor that it was a known fact that women can't think in three dimensions, and that's why they struggle with structural geology. So I'm not too sure where this came from, and at the time, I think I got to be fairly thick-skinned, and I thought, well, that's a ridiculous idea, but it stuck in my mind, and it worried me a little bit. This idea, oh my goodness, there's some biological barrier to solving structural geology puzzles.
Mm-hmm.
And the sort of falsity of this came to me a couple of years ago. So now fast forward to when I'm a professor at Queen's, and I'm chairing a comprehensive exam for a PhD student. And the topic is rock mechanics, rock failure in underground mines. And the candidate's male, the supervisor's male, but two of the examiners. And we have a 50-50 gender balance in our professors at Queen's. But so two of the examiners in this committee were two of my female colleagues. And we were at the point in the examination, so it's an oral examination of the student. It lasts about 3 hours. We were probably 2.5 hours in. And so it was pretty clear that the student had done okay and he was exhausted. And my two female colleagues, this is a wonderful moment. It happens sometime in these exams. They just started brainstorming about the content. And it was all about rock failure and how you visualize it. And they were saying, oh, well, you could do this. Oh, no, well, you could do this. You could use this algorithm. No, you could use that model. And, oh, you could use game theory. And I looked at these two women in this wonderfully creative brainstorming session, and I thought, right, women can't think in three dimensions, eh? Because that's exactly what these two were doing.
Well, my answer would have been they could think in 5D. So that's that's incredible. And so what happened to this student? What obviously he must have been.
That student did fine. I think my point was that student and the rest of us got in the room got to witness something quite remarkable when these two women began brainstorming and bouncing ideas off each other, which all had to do with visualizing in three dimensions. So,
amazing.
Yeah. So. Yeah.
So that's fantastic, and I think sometimes if we just let our guards down, or our sometimes I call them filters, and just enjoy each other's knowledge and skill sets, you can move in a very dynamic and proactive space, and come up with some amazing results. So, tell us a little bit more about. Your professional employment. So you certainly a professor, but you worked with different mining companies. My understanding is you still do. How do you see that? How did that influence you in your teaching and in your mentorship?
Okay, I think. I think we all bring our experience to teaching, and that definitely spills over into mentorship. I have had some links with mining companies. I've never really, I spent quite a few summers working in mineral exploration, but I never worked full time. So I have some understanding gleaned over the years. But, for the last 25 years I have been in the university, so in that environment. But in geology departments, of course, we have a lot of links to the real world, and I do research that involves mining companies, involves geological surveys, and increasingly communities as well. So that comes back into the classroom, and understandably then it comes back into the mentorship that I find myself involved with as a university professor, and in my connections with young women, either in their student life or beyond that.
So that's really interesting. Tell us a little bit more. So you mentioned the northern communities, and that's certainly one of my passions. But I think as the areas where we have discoveries or there are assets are increasingly remote, whether it's Baffinland, for example, you have
Yeah.
Agnico or TMAC or Baffinland Iron Mines or Northwest Territories, Yukon. Tell us a bit about those spaces and those experiences they're remote and the women or the people in general that work in our industry in those northern communities.
Hmm. Yeah, well, that's the Northern Canada is very dear to me. I mean, where I grew up was I would say it was the near north, right?
Yeah.
It's still very different from southern Ontario, where I have lived for most of my adult life.
Mm-hmm.
And I recognize that. I've been doing some work around Cobalt, Ontario, which is not too far from where I grew up, northeastern Ontario. And it does feel a little bit like going home. Those communities are quite different than, Toronto or Kingston. And up in the Northwest Territories, they're different again. And some of the mine sites, as you say, are very remote. So I find one of my things I've been fortunate to do is to make connections and allow, um, at least some of my students and the people I work with a chance to see that part of Canada and to interact with people who live in these more northern communities. So I try very hard, if possible, to make sure that my students can travel to these remote parts, more remote or more distant parts of Canada. It turns out that the Northwest Territories happens to be the area where I do most of my field work, and it's obviously expensive to bring students up there. Sometimes I think, oh well, we've got lots of samples, so maybe they don't need to go, but I think it's an important part of their education. And interacting with smaller communities, interacting with First Nation communities, one of the most important lessons that I hope they can learn is the importance of listening, actually. I think there's a tendency for those of us, maybe it's probably worse for professors, to come in with your expert technical knowledge and maybe some new research findings, and you're just so excited about imparting those and telling people, oh, I collected these rocks last summer and this is what I found, and it's taken me a long time to learn that an important part of it is whether you're starting a project or you are reporting a project, an important part of it is to just be quiet and listen to people and find out what their concerns are. Sometimes they're not going to be expressed really quickly. It may take some time. It may take a little bit of deeper understanding for context. And so as I've learned that, I'm hoping that and I guess this would be a part of mentorship, is to provide my students a chance to learn some of these things too. I think it's really important. If it's important in our industry, it's important in as us as Canadians, really, to understand some of the perspective of people who live in outside the major cities in southern Canada.
So thank you. So two questions. First, you talked about a lot of the work that you do is in Northern Canada. Can you give us an idea of what it is that what kind of work you're doing in that part of Canada?
Sure, I've had a number of projects, but in recent years, one of the most recent ones is I've been looking at Cantung mine. That's a former tungsten mine, which in the border between Northwest Territories and the Yukon. So it's in the Mackenzie Mountains. It's a spectacular area. And there, the mine went bankrupt in part because of some environmental problems that were just very expensive to fix. And so it reverted to the federal government, as often happens. And my my interest in this is that there is value in the tailings. So I do a lot of work in mine tailings. There's value in these tailings because it was a very rich mine and they weren't successful in recovering all the tungsten. So there's tungsten, gold, and copper in these tailings. And wouldn't it be ideally sustainable? That's a real sustainability solution if we could reprocess the tailings, they're already crushed, extract the additional tungsten, gold, and copper values, and use that to offset the environmental problem. So that's been a really interesting and a kind of a new idea for me, new to think about tungsten, new to think about reprocessing. The other thing, though, that I've been working on for indeed 20 years is the problem of arsenic around the Yellowknife area. And many people in Canada will have heard of Giant Mine. It's one of the two mines there that had an impact on the local environment, mainly because these were large and long-lived mines, so they were operating in the 1950s and 60s, where there was relatively little legislation or emission controls. And so we've been documenting the legacy and trying to work with both, again, as the federal government, but also the Yellowknife Dene First Nation and some of the Yellowknife residents to try to understand the potential risks associated with the legacy of this former gold mining. So that's been, I've had quite a few students work in that area, and it's a complex problem, and there's different perspectives. So again, I find it really important to get students up there and spend some time with people and say, well, it's not quite as clear cut as it might seem when you're sitting in the classroom down in Kingston. And
sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
I've done some work in the past on the diamond mines, but that was wrapped up a few years ago.
So this sounds absolutely fascinating to me, and particularly based on the fact that everybody is talking about tailings right now. So you say, you've been doing this for 20 years, which was way before I think tailings were trendy, or ICMM or any of the big organizations had them on their wish list, or maybe not wish list, but wish list of issues to address. And I know there's a huge legacy of arsenic and gold mines across Canada. So Nova Scotia, you're talking about Northwest Territories. So I think what I get from this is that what the wonderful part of geoscience is that there's nothing old or nothing new or nothing reinvented. It seems to be an ongoing process, and your curiosity and your knowledge and your involvement of people of different areas and different age groups have continued to propel the study that you've been doing. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes, I think so. I think there has been some increased public awareness of problems with mine tailings due to some major spills that have occurred in Canada and elsewhere in the last few years. And that has led to an awareness for increased science and engineering in that area. And, public consultation is a big part of that. So it's interesting, when going back to my early days as a geologist, that very summer that I was hired as a field assistant for mineral exploration, my father had been manager of a small mine in the area, unrelated to the people I was working for, and they had some mine tailings that were particularly problematic in terms of revegetating. And my father had a background as a farmer before he became a mining engineer. So he spent that summer trying to revegetate tailings, and I had no particular interest in the subject at that time. So I said, oh, great, Dad, that's fine. So, of course, I wish he was still alive to see that I had got into tailings later, yes.
Oh, he's watching you. But I think what you raise is something that is really important. part of the challenge for many of the young grads is they come out with absolutely amazing degrees from Queen's or Dalhousie or U of T or all our great schools across Canada, and are challenged to find jobs. And
Yes.
one of the elements you've referred to a number of times is the fact that there are other fields of interest that sort of flowed into your geoscience background. So whether it's your dad who was a farmer, I understand that you weren't really keen then, but this environmental concern, this concern about the impact, for example, of arsenic that goes beyond, I mean, obviously in the tailings, but beyond that, the impact on people or on nature. So one of the pieces of advice that I often suggest when I in the role that I am sometimes asked to act as a mentor is the multifunctional, pluridisciplinary. Don't just stay in one space or maybe not corner, but just in one area. Could you comment on that? Maybe the opportunity of looking at a few different fields almost at the same time, or what would your advice be?
That's a really good point. I think Siri is the flexibility, and I think I would encourage people, and I have encouraged people to to follow their passion, which is something that you hear quite often, but it's not just, there's another aspect to it that I found useful is also if you have an idea about something, say, oh, someday I'd really like to do this, or oh, I heard this talk that was really intriguing, or I remember seeing something and I had this idea. Just don't let those things go. You might have to set them aside for some time because, well, you're trying to finish a degree, or you have a very busy life, maybe with family responsibilities and a job. But somewhere, just don't let them go completely, because I found that sometimes going back to these ideas which were not fully formed, maybe they were just something that intrigued me, and then at some point, oh, I can pursue that a little bit farther, and it can blossom. It can be something really useful, and in fact, it may be an idea that where you thought you could solve a problem, and it turns out you're right. I think when I was younger, I used to sometimes think, oh, well, everybody thinks the way I do, or everybody wants what I want. So it's high. I used to think of the world as highly competitive, and there are certain aspects of it, but I think we all carve out our own sphere of interests and passions, and I think it's important to acknowledge that.
I like that. Carve out your own sphere of passions. I'm going to use that as a quote. That is that, and that I think that's really important. And what you just said rings true certainly to me, and I hope, and I'm sure to our audience, as we grow up or we grow into our fields of interest. Self-confidence is always a challenge. All
Oh
the
yeah.
work, so you just said you thought the world was certainly not maybe out to get you, but it was highly competitive and everybody thought like you, and there was nothing different or new or even special about you, that you were just like everybody else.
Hmm.
Can you talk to that a little bit, the importance of
Yeah.
self-confidence and helping
Uh,
us all move forward in our careers? And I'll take
yes.
notes.
I'm glad you brought that up, because self-confidence is something that sometimes is a little hard to come by, depending where you are, a stage of life. And setbacks can erode your self-confidence, or it you may be in an environment where everybody else seems to have something going for them, or things come more easily, and developing a core of inner strength is really important, and I think part of that is, as I said before, finding what you're passionate about. It's also acknowledging that you're not there alone, even if friends and family are hugely important as we go through our years of developing our career or finding our place. I know some of the hard years for me were actually when I was a mother of young children, because things had been going really. I had an exciting PhD and postdoc, and then it was really time to have a family. But in those days, I didn't have. I had a part-time work, but I didn't really have a career. So I knew that I was fortunate to have more time with my young children than some other women did, and have the financial ability to do that. But I also knew that, at some point, it was very important for me to gear up and get back into the career in a bigger way. So the circumstances in my life were such that there was a period of time where it was difficult for me to pursue my career, and that was hard on self-confidence. And I really had to pull it together later on. But the strength I drew was from my family itself, just in their belief in me. And then that helped me build up my own self-confidence.
Thank you. And so thank you for being vulnerable. I think we all, perhaps particularly as women, I'll speak for myself, generalizing is not always a good idea. We feel vulnerable, for whatever reason, about choices we either need to make, or it could be looking after an elderly parent, it could be looking after young children, a spouse or a partner that's not well, or even a friend. And so sometimes life catapults us into situations where certain choices are, I would say, forced upon us. Mm-hmm. One of the lessons I learned, and it took me a long time, was to ask for help. The one, being vulnerable, was you never did that, because if you were a true professional, of course, you couldn't admit that you didn't feel you were competent or smart, or both. But also the concern that many of us have, or may have, or have had, of reaching out and saying, I don't know how to do this, I need help. Can you talk a little bit to that feeling, and how people like yourself, who are mentors, and all the other incredible mentors we have within our environment, how they can help with that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So I've spent most of my career in the university environment. So we've got the teachers and the students, and so it's quite natural for the mentee-mentor relationship to follow those lines. But that doesn't mean, and I've certainly tried to be a mentor for the students that I've supervised as graduate students or as undergraduates. But sometimes that relationship, I'm thinking particularly of people that are doing their master's or their PhD. The relationship with a supervisor can be challenging, right? It's an important relationship, but it doesn't. What I've observed is it doesn't always mean that person is your best mentor, and I think it's important for people to understand that they may have a certain role as your supervisor, and but you may have to, and I think that's sometimes a little bit of a leap that students have to take. They may have to look elsewhere, whether it's a different professor who seems to have more empathy, or who maybe has some life experience closer to yours, whether it's a staff person or an advisor.
Or perhaps somebody who's just not judgmental and not part of your evaluation.
Exactly. So I do see, I've seen some students have difficulties because, and they really need to go beyond their immediate supervisor to ask for help. And even though that may not seem obvious at first, that might be something it might be the best route. So I think that's one thing that's quite important.
No, thank you about that. So it's finding that person who can guide you and not evaluate you. Maybe some tough love sometimes. We all need it in different times of our careers. What we can do better, what we shouldn't do or stop doing, and also how to be able to grow and to continuously learn and improve. So that part of the mentorship role for me has always been, for the mentors I've had in my career and still have, the ability to have that. So thank you for your insight on that. A question that has come a lot across my desk from the young professionals is, how do you combine all this new technology that's coming out, all this innovation, all this AI, with the science of the earth, the science of the rocks. There's a lot of concern right now and excitement. So it's a bit of a bipolar situation, or where there's attraction to all that's, the new sort of the gaming aspect of geosciences, dare I say it. But also at the same time, well, if there's all this machine knowledge and all this technology and all this innovation, I've just graduated, or I'm only 5 years into my career with a geoscience degree. Am I becoming redundant before I've even, reached my early 30s? Do you have any thoughts you can share with us on that?
That's a really interesting one, and I'm not an expert in the area, although um, interestingly, I had dinner with a former student in Yellowknife last week who works as an engineer, has probably 15, 18 years of experience since graduation's done all sorts of accomplishment. But she asked me almost the same question. She said, "Oh, I think I'm really out of date on X and Y topics." Um, and I think on the one hand, yes, there's some technical expertise you may need to acquire. You might not need to be an expert in everything. Um, but on the other hand, all of this needs to be ground truth. And one of the things about geology itself is that we're dealing with natural world. It's highly complex, highly heterogeneous. Um, and so that's sort of in a way a special inside knowledge I think as a geoscientist you might have is, well, at least you understand that a given mineral or a rock or a soil or a sediment or whatever you're dealing with, um, you know something about the characteristics of this material, and you know something about the complexity of it. So yes, I've heard a couple of really interesting and exciting talks on machine learning lately, including one in Yellowknife, which was more on the exploration side. Can it be
Mm-hmm.
applied?
Mm-hmm.
So I think if you've been out of school for a while, don't forget that you bring not only what you learned in school, but then your subsequent years, you bring that knowledge to if you're going to move into or augment your background in some of these more innovative high-tech methods, you're going to bring something to it, and you're going to bring your understanding of the complex nature of the earth and the earth science. And that's extremely important. I was just giving a lecture this morning to a visiting group from the National Research Council, and we were talking about some of the tools we use to understand the materials. It was mine tailings in this case we work with.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the new software we're using. And as I said, you can generate a lot of numbers, but the question is, do they mean something? Are they
Exactly.
right? Are they right? Are they accurate? And do they mean something? And you have to bring your expertise and your understanding of the materials to understand that. So I guess in a nutshell, I'd say um, don't underestimate your abilities to learn something new, but don't underestimate what you know already and what you bring to that.
Excellent. That's the example that I always like to give that's absolutely aligned with what you're saying is, my dad used to love slide rules, and this is going back a while, of course, and he just swore by them. And of course, computers came in before he passed away and all that. And he was obviously used them. And would he always, and I said, well, aren't you afraid that someday you'll be a dinosaur? And I love dinosaurs, by the way. So, and he said, no, because all these computers are, and this was going back a number of years, they're just tools, Siri. So it's like a slide rule on steroids, but I still need to use my experience as a geologist to interpret the information that's being spit out. And this was going back, I'll say about 20 years. So nothing even close to, what we have today, and certainly not what many people in the field like yourselves use. And so I really like that idea, because regardless of the area you're in, I think there are the tools, and thank goodness we have a lot of these extraordinary skills that come to us from different places. But at the end of the day, you still need a geologist or a geoscientist or a mining engineer to use his or her experience to analyze the results and make some advised decisions. So I thank you for your insight, because I think we tend to be afraid of what we don't understand, and technology is moving extremely quickly. I just got used to my iPhone, and they're all, kind of thing, and they're already onto, I don't know, other iPhones and other 5Gs, and it seems like you're just always catching up. But at the end of the day, it is just a telephone with a lot of information behind it. So I like what you're saying, to be curious, to want to learn, not to stay on the side, but also never to underestimate the skills and the experience that you bring to the table. And I like that insight. I think it's important. What do you see? So you've been in the field for a long time. Students, certainly all the people that supported you for the nomination for the award had incredible things to say about you. Many of them highlighted the importance for you to balance your work and your family, or your private life and your professional life. Looking forward, moving forward, what do you see for our industry and for women in the industry? That's a trick question. Sorry, I had that.
That's a hard question.
I know.
But let me start first, because I haven't really had the chance to say it explicitly this afternoon, is how moved I was by receiving this award. I mean, an award for mentorship is something that is probably more important to me than anything else that could be acknowledged. So it was a wonderful to hear that I had been awarded this last year. So what's ahead, you're asking me? I guess I could make a couple of comments. I don't think I have a great visionary sort of insight in this field, but from my perspective, and not only being in the university and teaching here, but also watching what my former students do, I think that there are some issues, and I am influenced by working in the North, but there's some influences that are going to be something we will be part of our lives and part of our work. And one, for example, is climate change. I think no matter where you're working, this is something that people are thinking of. It may influence. I mean, mining and climate change. There are a number of scientists, and I have a couple of parts of my research program that deal with things like extreme weather events. How do mining operations handle that? How do policymakers look ahead and say, oh, well, how are we going to set up regulations in the face of these changing conditions? Can we look to the past? I have a PhD student just finishing, and one part of her thesis was looking to the past, looking in back to the Holocene, actually back in geological time, and looking at lake sediments and saying, okay, it was warmer back then. Well, what did that do to the distribution of metals in lake sediments? So I think climate change is just increasingly part of people's lives, whether they're operating on the ground, whether they're conducting research, and also in their daily lives. And the other one that's really important for Canadians, but elsewhere in the world too, is our reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and the important parts that that communities play in the, including Indigenous communities, play in the sort of decisions that we're making about the extraction industries and about transportation corridors and moving our resources to market and all those aspects. And so these are challenges that go beyond maybe what we learned in school, and although they shouldn't be beyond what we're teaching in school now, but that we all need to keep in mind. And it's part of the mineral life cycle, and therefore it's part of our professional life.
I'm just writing this down. Part of the mineral life cycle. I think that's totally brilliant.
Well, I will tell you how that came to mind. That part, being part of the mineral life cycle, is actually I gave a talk a few weeks ago to a non geological audience, an audience of students from environmental studies, and I was talking about mine waste and how mine waste we have per capita in Canada. How much we produce every year, which is about 13, 14 times the amount of household waste we produce by volume. And I was saying to these people, well, you may think that's not your problem because you're not in a mining company. It's it's their problem. It's the industry's problem. But I said, we use all the products. We have our laptops, our bicycles, our cars, our infrastructure. We use all the products from the mining industry. So yes, we are, as consumers, part of the mining life cycle. So that's made me start to think about it a little bit more.
Yeah, no, that's certainly in my field of work, which is around sustainability and stakeholder engagement within the natural resource industry. There's absolutely no doubt that from very early on, up until closure, climate change is a leading driver, and the partnerships with all our stakeholders, but particularly with the Indigenous community. So back again to the multifunctional approach which you advocate, which is, yes, mining engineering or geoscience, but with other areas, whether they're official studies or just come out of knowledge that you acquire with your experience or in exchanging with other people, it becomes very important to evolve and move forward. So we have about 10 minutes left. So you were very concerned in our rehearsals about the length of time. As you can see, the time, I know I could certainly continue listening to you. And I will say on behalf of all of Women in Mining Canada, all of the people who nominated you and the industry in general, we are proud of you. We thank you for your contributions to our industry, for being that mentor, for being that person that lights the way, that remains positive and dynamic and passionate. And so thank you, which is hardly enough. But there is one question that came from one of your listeners, whom I understand is also a former student. And the question is, what would you say, or what would your comments be around imposter syndrome?
Okay, imposter syndrome. So I think, if I'm correct, what the questioner is referring to is the sense that you're in a role, you're expected to make decisions and carry on in your professional role, but there's doubts. I think I'm right about this. There's doubts that you're really maybe qualified to do this. This is the
Or the
sense of
right
the
person.
imposter. Yeah, or you are
Yes.
the right person. And I hope that's what the questioner meant. And I mean, it's not unfamiliar to me, and I think a couple of things I would say. Well, part is the self-confidence issue, is that you may know a whole lot more than you think, but there's the other thing that, and I do I do try to keep this a mainstay of my role as a teacher and a supervisor of student research, is the question of honesty and being able to say I don't know. I don't know that area. So because I work in the area of environment, I'm often in public lectures or interviews, I'm asked about things like toxicity or human health and a risk assessment, which I know a little bit about, but I do tell people I only know a little bit about. What I know a lot more about is the nature and the materials we're looking at, and we have to get somebody who has a human health expertise involved to answer that question. So I think this balance between being self-confident in what you do know and very honest, integrity is hugely important, and it's as so many people have said, it gets eroded in some popular discourse, but it's hugely important. So if saying I don't know, I need to find somebody else to help answer this question. I'm listening to your question. I know it's important, but not pretending you know something when you don't know it.
Thank you. That's very important. The integrity piece, I think, as we speak today, and I'm sure you know something also about ESG, which is environment, socio-economic, or certainly my version, and governance, this governance space where it is important to obviously share your knowledge, but also to be honest and transparent about whether you're interfacing with your communities, with the Indigenous people who are partnering on the land with you, about what you do know and also what you don't know. And again, I would say maybe the humility or the modesty of acknowledging we're not all things to all people, but particularly in leadership roles where people almost expect you to absolutely have the answers to everything, and you may not, or you probably don't, but you are, one, transparent about it, and also open to help find the solution with the right experts. And I think that's very important. And I would actually bring that answer back to the question in the imposter syndrome, or that the question is that parents are like that, and children will often ask, and I have nieces and nephews who would say, well, how come and why? And you sort of look up to your parents or your aunts and uncles, and they expect you to know everything. And I mean, there's Google, of course, or all our search engines, but it's also being honest enough to say, well, I may be your mom or your dad or your aunt, but I do not know, and let's look it up together. Let's find an answer together. So I think there are, back to your life work balance, I think there's so many spaces and places where there are positive and dynamic areas that actually do come together, and we can use them and be inspired by them in our careers and at home as well. Would you agree?
Yes, I really do agree. I think that's quite important, and we're talking about mentorship, and part of it is being a role model, right? So
Yeah.
if I'm in front of a classroom and a student asks me something, or maybe even challenges me about something I've said, then I really try to not brush over it. I think but say, oh, that's really interesting, and try to resolve it as much as possible. Or sometimes I have to say, okay, the next class we're going to take that up again because I think that's a really interesting point and I need to do some background reading on it. So I think as a role model aspect, it's very important to show that to be honest and explain that you can't be all things to all people, as you say.
So Heather, there are 5 minutes left. So for somebody who was concerned you wouldn't have much to say, it's been fantastic. Two points I'd like you perhaps to address before we close off. The first one is who in your are there people who are better mentors than others? Are there can anybody be a mentor? The other one, which is slightly unrelated, is you mentioned you work a lot in the north and in remote areas. What are your thoughts on how women in mining Canada and women in mining Yukon or women in mining Northwest Territories, how can we help the communities in the north come closer to us as organizations, and how can we support them? So 2 questions, 5 minutes. You're on.
Wow. Okay,
who
so
can be a mentor?
Who can be a mentor? I mean, I think almost anybody could be a mentor, but some mentors are more useful than others. And so maybe, how can you recognize somebody who is potentially a mentor to you or has a potential to be a mentor to you? I think, you need the empathy. You need somebody who's interested in sharing their experiences and in listening to you. And listening to the issues that are of most concern. You need availability too. Some people, it's unfortunate, but there's some people who are just so overwhelmed by the demands of their professional life or their professional and private life that they're simply not available. You need somebody who does listen and does understand exactly what your concerns are. And so recognizing that might take a few conversations. The other aspect of a mentor is, which I have recommended to people, is look for somebody who has a job that you want to have in the future, or you think you might want to have, and find out how they got it. That's not exactly a mentor because that in that case you're trying to get the information rather than just the support. But that's another avenue of a relationship that might really help you advance your career.
A good indication.
Yeah. You might find out, well, how did they get to, you might think, well, they've always been in this direction. I mean, I didn't even do my PhD in environmental geochemistry. That was a later life conversion. And then the other thing you asked me about was the North.
And how we can help networks and support our colleagues and our women in the North.
Well, I know that I think it was just launched last week that there is another Women in Mining Canada chapter in the Northwest Territories. It was launched in Yellowknife, so that's great. I hope to be in touch with them. I think I know it's far away and it's an expensive plane ticket, but I think spending time in the North is an eye-opener for many of us if you have a connection or responsibility in your role. I also learned something, I don't know why it took me quite a few years to learn it, is people tend to go, especially researchers, tend to go to the North in the summer, in the very short summer, right? And that's a very busy time of people. People who live any sort of traditional form of life, they're out in the land, so they may be busy at all times of year, but they're particularly busy in the summer. Some people take holidays. So I was in quite a remote community up in Big Great Bear Lake, and the chief of that community said to me, "Oh, researchers are a little bit like geese. They come in the spring, they leave in the fall, and if they hang around too long, we think about shooting them," which was a very dramatic statement, but he kind of made his point that community, and these are often very, there's less than 300 people there, felt a little overwhelmed by how many Southerners they needed to deal with in the summer. So that's why I go up in November. And I don't expect people to answer all my emails. I go up in November and I meet somebody. I say, well, let's go for coffee, and do a lot of listening. And I'd never get the insights and the perspective that the modest amount I have to date if I didn't spend time in the North and learn to be quiet and listen more often than coming across as the expert.
Well, thank you. That analogy is quite vivid. So, and I know that you're certainly more than any kind of goose I know. So, thank you for that. Heather, thank you so much for your time, for sharing your thoughts and your insights. To all of you out there who are listening, I know some are far away. Thank you for staying up. Heather is an amazing trailblazer, an amazing mentor, an amazing person, and an amazing woman. Thank you. And this will end our webinar, but also I would like to encourage all of you, wherever you are, from all the Trailblazer winners to the nominations. Please remember we will be opening the 2020 awards season, so to speak, next week. Think of all the women you know in the industry in one area or another who are worthy, and I know there's so many of them, to be nominated either for the Trailblazer Award, the Indigenous Trailblazer Award, our Student Awards, or the Mentorship Award. So if you have any questions, there's the address on the screen, info@wimcanada.org. It will be our pleasure to get back to you. Until then, thank you again, Heather. Have a great afternoon. And thank you to Lily and KPMG for supporting us. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thanks, Siri.